The room buzzed with the familiar chaos of a pre-match press conference. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, flashes illuminating the sleek backdrop adorned with sponsor logos. Journalists murmured among themselves, some scrolling through their notes, others whispering speculations about the upcoming game. The air carried a strange energy, part excitement, part tension. It was the kind of atmosphere that always preceded big moments. Mohamed Salah stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had been here countless times before. Dressed in his club's official tracksuit, he took his seat at the front, adjusting the microphone slightly before resting his hands on the table. His posture was relaxed, his demeanor composed. He had done this 100 times. Answer the questions, give the headlines they wanted, then leave. Just another day in football. But something felt different this time. The whispers among the journalists didn't die down immediately, lingering longer than usual. There was an air of anticipation, a sense that something was brewing beneath the surface. Salah felt it, but he didn't show it. He simply waited, his gaze scanning the room briefly before settling straight ahead. The club's media officer cleared his throat, signaling the start of the conference. "Good afternoon, everyone. We'll take questions now." Hands shot up instantly. A journalist from a well-known sports outlet was the first to be acknowledged. His question was routine, straightforward, something about tactics for the upcoming match. Salah answered it with ease, his voice steady, professional. Another question followed, then another. Business as usual. Then, from the back of the room, a voice cut through the noise. "Mohamed, let's be honest here. Do you really think you belong among the greats? Or are you just another good player in the right system at the right time?" The murmurs stopped. The tension in the room shifted, thickening like a storm cloud. Every head turned toward the source of the question, Daniel Reeves, a journalist notorious for his sharp tongue and controversial takes. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug, half-smile creeping onto his face. He wasn't here for football analysis. He was here for something else. Salah's fingers tapped lightly against the table. He didn't react, not yet. But the air around him had changed. This was no ordinary press conference anymore. Daniel Reeves sat near the middle of the press room, his notepad resting on his knee, though he had barely written a word. He didn't need to. His question was already prepared, rehearsed in his mind over and over again. He wasn't here to analyze formations or ask about Salah's fitness ahead of the match. He was here to make a statement, to prove once and for all that Mohamed Salah was not the legend people made him out to be. For years, Reeves had been one of Salah's loudest critics. He had built a reputation for tearing apart players he deemed overrated, and Salah had been a favorite target. A system player, he had called him. Good, but not great. He had written article after article suggesting that without Liverpool's tactics, Salah would be just another forward. Fast, skillful, but forgettable. And now he had the chance to say it to his face. He watched as Salah answered the first few questions, his responses measured and thoughtful as always. He never gave too much away, never let anyone see beneath the surface. That annoyed Reeves. He wanted something real. A crack in the armor, a reaction. That was the moment he was waiting for. Reeves shifted in his seat, tapping his pen against the notepad. He could feel it. The room was settling into a rhythm, Salah fielding each question with effortless composure. But that was about to change. He leaned forward slightly, angling himself toward the microphone. When the moment was right, when the silence stretched just long enough for him to own the space, he spoke. "Mohamed, let's be honest here. Do you really think you belong among the greats? Or are you just another good player in the right system at the right time?" His voice was calm, casual even, but the words were a dagger, designed to cut, to humiliate, to force a response. A few journalists turned their heads, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Some glanced at Salah, waiting to see how he would react. Others exchanged wary looks, knowing exactly what Reeves was doing. Salah didn't move. He didn't shift in his seat or furrow his brows in irritation. He simply looked at Reeves, his expression unreadable. The room fell into a tense silence. This was exactly what Reeves wanted. A confrontation. A moment that would go viral. He had spent years chipping away at Salah's legacy from the comfort of a newsroom. Now he was finally face to face with him. and he wasn't leaving without an answer. The press conference had settled into a steady rhythm. Questions came and went, Salah answering each one with the same calm professionalism that had become his trademark. The journalists scribbled notes, cameras clicked, and for a moment it felt like just another routine media session. Then a hand went up near the middle of the room. Daniel Reeves. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The subtle tightening of shoulders, the quick glances exchanged between journalists who knew what was coming. The moderator hesitated for a brief second before nodding in Reeves's direction. The microphone was passed down the row, and as it reached him, a slow smirk curled at the corner of his mouth. Reeves leaned forward slightly, positioning himself just right for the cameras. His voice was smooth, practiced, with just the right amount of casual arrogance to make it seem like he wasn't trying to stir the pot, when in reality, that was his exact intention. "Mohamed," he began, pausing, just long enough to let every ear in the room tune in. "People say you're a good player, but not a great one." He tilted his head slightly, watching for the first sign of a reaction. "They say you don't have the mentality of a true champion." A small scoff, just barely audible. "What do you say to that?" The energy in the room shifted. The air felt thicker. Even the clicking of cameras seemed to slow as every journalist turned their attention towards Salah. Some of them knew this was coming. Reeves had been pushing this narrative for years, on television, in print, on every platform that would give him a microphone. But now he was saying it directly to Salah's face. Salah blinked once, his expression unreadable. He didn't immediately reach for the mic, didn't rush to defend himself. Instead, he let the silence stretch just a little longer than expected. Long enough to make Reeves shift slightly in his seat, as if he wasn't sure whether his question had hit its mark or if it had simply been tossed into the void. Salah inhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly against the table. His body language was relaxed, but there was something in his eyes. Something measured. Something unwavering. The cameras zoomed in, the journalists leaned forward. And then, finally, Salah moved. He reached for the mic, lifted it slightly, and in that quiet, steady voice of his, he gave an answer no one in the room was expecting. Reeves watched Salah with the patience of a man who had laid a perfect trap and was waiting for his prey to step into it. He could feel the weight of the room shifting, the silent expectation crackling in the air like static before a storm. Salah hadn't responded yet, but that didn't matter. The hesitation, the pause, this was his moment to push further, to get under his skin, to make headlines. He leaned forward slightly, the smirk never leaving his face. "Come on," he said, voice dripping with feigned amusement. "Be honest, without Liverpool's system, would we even be talking about you?" A few scattered chuckles echoed through the room, not loud enough to be an outright insult, but just enough to add fuel to the moment. Salah's name alone commanded respect, but football was brutal, and doubt was as much a part of the game as goals and trophies. Reeves knew that. He had spent years feeding those doubts, throwing questions into the air that never needed answers, only reactions. Some journalists shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting down to their notepads as if suddenly occupied by something more important. They knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't just a question. This was a challenge, a calculated move meant to provoke. Salah had handled tough questions before, but this wasn't about tactics or injuries. This was personal. Salah finally lifted his gaze, his expression calm. Too calm. Reeves kept the smirk in place, waiting for even the smallest sign of irritation. A twitch in the jaw, a flicker of annoyance in the eyes, anything. But Salah gave him nothing. For a brief second, the press room felt like a battleground. Two men sitting across from each other, one trying to stir the fire, the other refusing to burn. Salah exhaled, slow and measured. Then, just as Reeves was about to open his mouth again, he picked up the mic. The storm was about to break. The room held its breath. The question hung in the air, thick with challenge, waiting to be acknowledged. Salah didn't move. He didn't shift in his seat or furrow his brow. He didn't scoff or shake his head. He simply sat there, his fingers resting lightly on the table, the microphone inches from his hand. And he let the silence stretch. A second passed, then another. The smirk on Reeves' face remained, but something was different now. It wasn't as sharp, wasn't as certain. He had expected a reaction, a frown, a shake of the head, maybe even a defensive response. That was the point of all this. He had built his career on knowing how to push players just enough to make them stumble. But Salah wasn't stumbling. The Egyptian forward finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Reeves. There was no anger in them, no irritation. Just something deeper, something unshakable. It was the kind of look that made a man second-guess himself before he even understood why. The quiet dragged on and the tension in the room shifted. What had started as Reeves's moment of control was slipping into something else entirely. The journalists felt it. The cameras felt it. Even the air seemed different, heavier. A few seats away, someone cleared their throat, the sound awkward and forced in the oppressive silence. The laughter that had followed Reeves' question was gone now, the amusement fading into discomfort. Some of the journalists who had chuckled now looked down, suddenly fascinated by their notes. Others exchanged glances as if realizing they were witnessing something they hadn't quite expected. Reeves shifted slightly in his chair. Not much. Just enough for someone watching closely to notice. Salah still hadn't spoken a single word. And yet, somehow, he had already answered. The silence had stretched so long it felt like a force of its own, pressing down on the room, daring someone to break it. And then, finally, Salah moved. He leaned forward just slightly, his fingers brushing against the microphone before wrapping around it. The shift was subtle, deliberate. Every eye in the room was on him. The cameras zoomed in. The journalists held their breath. And then he spoke. "Greatness isn't about what people say," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "It's about what you do, consistently, when the pressure is highest." There was no emotion in his tone, no anger, no frustration, just certainty. Reeves blinked, his smirk flickering, just for a moment. Salah continued, his words slow and measured. "If I'm only good because of Liverpool, then why did I succeed in Italy? Why did I lead my country to the World Cup?" His eyes didn't leave Reeves. "Why do defenders still struggle to stop me?" The words landed like a hammer. No bravado, no theatrics, just facts. The room was completely still now, the usual hum of shifting bodies and quiet whispers gone. Salah wasn't defending himself. He was reminding them. Reeves opened his mouth slightly, but nothing came out. His own trap had turned against him, the weight of Salah's words too solid to shake. Salah let the moment breathe, scanning the room before speaking again. "I don't need to sit here and tell you who I am," he said, his voice softer now, but just as powerful. "The game speaks for me." A murmur spread through the room. Not just from the journalists, but from the staff standing at the edges, even the ones who had heard 1,000 press conferences before. Reeves shifted in his seat, gripping his pen tighter. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Salah had answered the question, and yet somehow it felt like he had said much more. Salah didn't look away. His expression remained calm, his voice steady. But there was something in his tone now, something sharper, more deliberate. He wasn't just answering a question anymore, he was shifting the entire conversation. "Daniel," he said, leaning forward slightly, "you've been in this business a long time, right?" Reeves hesitated. The shift in energy was sudden, unexpected. He had spent years questioning Salah's greatness, but he had never been the one under the spotlight. Still, he forced a nod, trying to maintain his composure. "Then you know how football works," Salah continued, his voice carrying across the silent room. "You've seen legends rise. You've watched careers unfold. Tell me, do you think they doubted themselves every time someone like you questioned them?" The press room went completely still. Even the soft hum of camera shutters had stopped. Salah wasn't playing defense anymore. He was taking control. Reeves' mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He wasn't sure how to answer. He had spent years analyzing, critiquing, tearing players down from the safety of a press box. But never had one turned the question back on him like this. Never had he been asked to justify his own words. Salah didn't press him for an answer. He simply let the silence settle, let the weight of his words sink into the air between them. The balance of power in the room had shifted and everyone could feel it. Some of the journalists exchanged glances, sensing that they were witnessing something different, something bigger than just another press conference. Salah wasn't just answering Reeves's question, he was exposing it. Reeves shifted in his seat. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but in a room full of seasoned journalists trained to pick up on the slightest details, it might as well have been a full retreat. He cleared his throat as if searching for a response, but nothing came. Salah's question hung in the air unanswered, unchallenged. A few journalists exchanged glances, some raised their eyebrows, impressed. Others simply nodded, understanding what had just happened. Salah hadn't just countered Reeves, he had dismantled the entire premise of his argument. And he had done it without raising his voice, without anger, without needing to prove anything. Reeves had come here to make Salah question himself. Instead, he was the one struggling for words. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Salah didn't press him further. He didn't need to. He simply sat there, composed, as if he had all the time in the world. His confidence wasn't loud, wasn't boastful, it was steady, unshakable. The kind that didn't need to be proven because it had already been earned. Reeves ran a hand over his notepad as if flipping through his notes would somehow give him a way back into control. But there was no way back. Salah had turned the tables effortlessly, and now all Reeves could do was sit there, exposed. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. The room, once charged with anticipation, now felt different. This wasn't just about a journalist and a footballer anymore. It was about something bigger. Respect, resilience, the quiet power of knowing exactly who you are, no matter who tries to challenge it. And for the first time in his career, Daniel Reeves had nothing left to say. For a long moment, the room remained frozen in silence. The weight of Salah's words still hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Reeves, his usual smirk now completely gone, sat stiffly in his chair, his notepad untouched in front of him. He looked like a man who had prepared for every possible outcome, except this one. Then, from the front row, a single pair of hands broke the silence. A journalist, one of the older, more seasoned ones, clapped slowly, deliberately. His expression wasn't one of amusement, but of respect. Another journalist joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the press room erupted in applause, not the forced, polite kind, but the genuine sound of people acknowledging what they had just witnessed. It wasn't about taking sides, it wasn't about humiliating Reeves, it was about something far greater. Salah had been provoked, challenged in front of the world, and he had responded not with arrogance or anger, but with composure, with quiet strength. He hadn't needed to defend himself, his career had already done that. All he had done was remind them why his name belonged among the greats. Reeves felt his face grow hot. He shifted in his seat, suddenly very aware of how many eyes were on him. He wanted to say something, to take back control of the moment, but the damage was already done. Not because Salah had humiliated him, but because Salah hadn't needed to. He leaned back in his chair, gripping his pen tightly, but he didn't write anything down. There was no angle to spin this, no headline that would make him look like the winner. He had lost, not in a battle of words, but in a battle of presence. Salah didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or bask in the applause. He simply placed the microphone back on the table, nodded politely, and sat back. He had said everything he needed to say, and the world had heard it loud and clear. The applause slowly faded, but the shift in the room remained. Journalists exchanged glances, some still scribbling notes, others simply watching as Salah leaned back in his chair. The tension that had filled the air moments ago was gone, replaced by something different. Respect. Salah reached for his water, taking a small sip before setting it down with quiet precision. There was no rush, no urgency. He had done what he came to do. Answer questions, face the scrutiny, and without meaning to, remind everyone why his name belonged in the conversation of greatness. A member of the club's media team signaled that the press conference was coming to an end. Salah glanced around the room, offering a small nod to the reporters. He reached for the microphone one last time. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice was calm, steady, unchanged from the moment he had walked in. Then he stood. There was no smirk, no final glance toward Reeves, no need to acknowledge the man who had tried to put cracks in his legacy. Salah had nothing to prove to him. He had nothing to prove to anyone. He adjusted his jacket, gave a polite nod to the moderator, and turned toward the exit. The cameras followed his every step, capturing the image of a man who had just won a battle without ever throwing a punch. Reeves sat motionless, staring at his untouched notepad. He had spent years doubting Salah, questioning his impact, his status among football's elite. But at this moment, none of that mattered. The world had just seen the answer for themselves. Salah reached the door. One last flash from a photographer lit up the room. Then, without a single glance back, he walked out. Because true greatness isn't proven in arguments, it's proven in moments like these.